Good evening and welcome to Mets 360 here on Riverside. Yeah, I have to stop and think about it for a second. Riverside is where we're doing it this year. I'm very pleased to be joined by one of the writers from the site, a gal for all seasons. You know her, you love her. It's Taryn Cooper. Coop, how are
Yeah,
you?
I'm doing great, Brian. Thanks for. I'm glad that we were able to get this podcast like the old days.
Yeah, you and I did several podcasts way back when. I go through stretches where I do this for like a year or so, and then I stop for a year or so. So I'm really pleased to be back in the driver's seat and talking about the Mets. So let's get right to it. The Mets have some interesting things going on in their infield. They've got a couple of different options at second base and third base, and I'm curious to know how you think those two positions are going to play out moving forward.
It's an interesting question to think about because I feel like we're finally at a time where there's like a spoil of the riches in those areas, and I even say this unironically with this is kind of like the year of the celebration of David Wright, and they're going to be, and we know he was at the third base corner all those years, and he really solidified that position. I don't know if you saw the old video, An Amazing Era. It was based on the 25th anniversary of the Mets in 1980. He had this song about all of the third basemen for the Mets,
Hmm.
and it was like a really clever song, and I could probably recite it by heart, but I'll spare everybody the details. But until David Wright, it was really. I mean, of course, you also had Hojo there in the 80s, but in early 90s, but you had David Wright there, and that was really it. And now, and has there really been maybe a like the quintessential second baseman for the Mets? I mean, Wally Backman? I mean, I really, that we really never had. I guess we could argue everybody in the infield except for maybe Jose Reyes and David Wright and the early aughts and whatever. But that leads me to today, and we have guys like Mark Vientos and Brett Beatty and even Luis Angel Acuna, and we've had a lot of conversations, a lot of back and forth about Acuna. We might have differences of opinion for him, but I really do think that we kind of have like the spoils of the riches, and it's not as dire of a situation as we might have thought. Mark Vientos, he's still gonna, I still think he's gonna break out. Brett Beatty has been doing amazing since his call up. And Acuna is streaky, but he's also very quick and he can play, a lot of the infield. I actually have a very positive outlook on those positions in the infield, quite personally.
Now, we've seen Beatty and Vientos play in the same game, and obviously, Beatty being the better fielder, he's the one who's playing third base, and Vientos DHs in those games. Do you see that as the type of thing that may happen a lot more moving forward?
I I could see that, because I do agree with you that Beatty might have the slight edge over, him, defensively, but and Vientos, I think, has a better, um, a better handle of the bat than him. I mean, Beatty has actually been doing incredibly well. Again, I'll say that, once more since he came back, and but I think I could absolutely see that. Vientos has had some defensive web gems. Like let's give him a little bit of credit there. But I do think obviously Beatty would be the stronger one of the two, and we could see that maybe play out in a platoon somehow.
And as far as second base goes, we've seen Acuna get a lot of playing time earlier in the season, but it seems here recently he's been more of a platoon player, late inning defensive replacement player. Do you think he's a platoon player, or do you see a more full time role for him in the future?
Oh, I think that's kind of a loaded question, but I actually have a very high opinion of Luis Angel Acuna. I think that the Mets might even be selling him a little bit short. And I don't know if that's, I've seen this type of thing play out with our prospects. I often like to say I survived Lassing's millage because we had such high hopes for him, and then they totally screwed up his development. And we could say that about, guys like Mike Pelfrey by calling him up too early and not having enough seasoning in the minors. We're seeing finally them sort of this play out with like our prospects who were, obviously Acuna is not a prospect anymore. He's playing with the big league club. But my sense is they're still trying to figure out where he's going to fit in. Like I said, it's the spoils of the riches. That's not a terrible thing for this team right now. But then you have, okay, where is he going to fit in the grand scheme of things? I think it's just figuring out, one thing that I've noticed about Acuna is that he seems to be very streaky. And we've seen how streaks are playing out right now against the Yankees and the Red Sox when, some of the bats go cold and some go hot and they're not clicking on all cylinders. And that's going to happen in over 162 games. And when Acuna is streaky, unfortunately, it might be also at a time when the rest of the team can't pick him up. So, um, I think I can absolutely see him as an everyday player, but like I said, there's a spoil of the riches right now, and we've seen this team not afraid to make bold moves, and how that plays out for Acuna, I guess, remains to be seen.
So among Acuna and Beatty and McNeil and Vientos, we have four people for more or less two positions. Let's throw another option into the mix, and that's Ronny Mauricio. Of course, Mauricio, one of the baby Mets from a couple of years ago, missed all of 2024 with an injury, and now he's working his way back. He's back in AAA now in his minor league rehab, and he hit home runs in back-to-back games. So it seems like he's going to factor into the mix as well. So how do you see him being included in the four people we were talking about earlier?
So, believe it or not, in my household, I'm married to another Mets fan. We talk about Ronnie Mauricio quite a bit. And I think we've had like this exact discussion. Where does Mauricio fit into the grand scheme of things? And I don't know if you're familiar with the show Baseball Night in New York. It's on SNY. It's typically on before all of the game, before the evening games during the week. But I actually can see Mauricio having the biggest impact in center field. Like I said, the infield seems to be the spoils of the riches right now. We have, Acuna, Beatty, Vientos, McNeil. We have all these guys who can play, I don't even want to say multiple positions, but they can play multiple positions. I've seen Jeff McNeil being able to fill in wherever the Mets want him to go. And I think that's really great. But as far as Mauricio goes, I think he's probably, in my opinion, he probably had the biggest upside to all of those baby Mets. And this is with me being like a huge Francisco Alvarez fan. I love catchers, but I often saw Mauricio as being like that kind of cornerstone of the baby Mets. And unfortunately, like you said, his injuries have kind of kept him out and, kept his development back for a year. But I do see if he is tearing it up in the minors, you can't really ignore that, especially like I said, we saw what happens when the Mets, big bats go on a break. You're gonna need, some kind of injection into the lineup, so to speak. So if that means he's got to play center field, Ronnie better start taking some fly balls in center field in Syracuse.
You bring up an excellent point because there does seem to be some playing time available in center field. One thing that frustrates me about David Stearns, who I've liked more than I expected that I would when he was hired, is that he hasn't made it a priority for people to play multiple positions, at least the current wave of prospects. We see down in the A ball level, people switching among various positions, giving them opportunities. But we saw what happened with Mauricio, where he stayed at shortstop, even though we knew he wasn't going to play at shortstop. We saw a tiny bit with Acuna and Jet Williams getting some time in center field. But as far as I know, Mauricio has not played any center field, and it seems like they want to keep him on the dirt. But they can do that if they move. And I know he got into a game and played the last two or three innings in center field. So that's something. Before I consider any of them really an answer in center, they need to get some reps somewhere.
Oh
And
yeah,
let's
absolutely.
start sooner than later.
Right, and you bring up, something that I've even written about for the site is that the Mets decided to go long on futures and, they're really starting to invest, like you said, you mentioned Jet Williams, and there's so many names of players and young pitchers, and I'm like, "Oh my goodness, they're also prospects." When was the last time we were able to say anything like that as, following the Mets as closely as we do? And I feel like they're just, they're not really afraid to be bold. Maybe, you feel that he should be taking more licks in center field. He has been. It hasn't been a lot, but he should be. And it would be, I think, foolish to not at least try because Mauricio has shown, an incredible amount of talent of being able to adapt to new things. But, we also have to realize that some of these guys are on display for a reason, if you know what I mean. And they're not afraid to kind of put them out there maybe as a trade chip. And that's why I keep saying there's like a spoil the riches in some of these areas that they would be foolish to not at least, listen to, how to improve. Because one of the things I like to say is, you don't have to screw somebody over in a deal for it to work out for you, I think as Mets fans, we're a little apprehensive about making those deals because we've seen so many of them not work out in our favor. But then when you look at the Lindor trade, and we're still seeing benefits from that all those years later. So you can take what prospects can be, and they can just simply be prospects.
Well, as long as we're talking about homegrown hitters, let's talk about Pete Alonso. Alonso had a interesting offseason and then signed with the Mets before spring training began and got to have a normal spring training, which I thought was a big deal. And then he got off to just a tremendous start. And that tremendous start was helped greatly by swinging at strikes and not swinging at balls. And at one point, I think it was something like 20 walks and 18 strikeouts, something like that. Just a phenomenal ratio. But here lately, in his last 14 games, he has 3 walks and 24 strikeouts, which is the opposite of phenomenal. So, do you believe his strike zone discipline from the start of the season can return?
I think it will, simply because one thing that I've noticed is that Pete Alonso tends to get in his head quite a bit. And when he was very like I saw a different Pete at the beginning of the season that we haven't seen probably since 2022. And he just was just his head was in the game, he was locked and loaded, he was ready to go. Um, I I think he has to come around simply because he's playing for a contract. He's playing for his future. He believed in himself, and I don't really, I don't really like to say that because it was like, he bet on himself or whatever. I really don't like to say that, but he did. He had something to prove. And it was like, you have this guy who is going to clearly, have the Mets all-time home run record eventually. And I just feel like there's just some kind of thunk with those big bats going on right now. Like you can't really ignore it. Um, he'll snap out of it eventually, I think. But what I don't want to see is just those like weak at bats that we were seeing in the previous years. Um, I we were in the Mets 360 chat during the game in Milwaukee last year when he turned it on, and he seemed to be a different player after that, even start at the beginning of the season. So, um, he'll come around, I think.
In writing about this recent slump of Alonso's and the big discrepancy between his walks and his strikeouts, some people have said that, he's been the victim of some close calls that went the pitcher's way. And I don't disagree with that, but to me, if that was what was going on, we'd see something like 12 walks and 20 strikeouts. But the complete collapse of his walk rate is very troubling to me. And it's easy to get too worked up about it because it is only 14 games, but still To go from a pretty much even, if not a better walk rate than a strikeout rate to an 8-to-1 strikeout walk ratio,
Yeah.
that's a giant red flag as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it is, but I also think, one of the things that I will see about Pete is that he can be kind of a free swinger with those meatballs, those strikes. Yeah, like I said, I think he might just be a little too eager, and especially there's been a lot of focus on the other big bats. Like I said, Lindor is slumping, except yesterday he seemed to come around. Soto has been very, people have been really getting on his case, especially since he went back home, quote unquote, to Yankee Stadium. I mean, I just think it's just bad timing. So something's got to give. He'll revert to form, I'm sure. He's got a lot to play for, Pete.
All right, well, let's switch from talking about the game in between the lines and talk a little bit about the game in the stands. You get to go to a lot of games, not that I'm jealous or anything, but you get to go to a lot of games, and I want to know your feelings, your experiences as a fan, and how much does the current experience of being at the game matter? And the example that I want to at least start us talking off about this is, what would it be like from your point of view if we went back to like a 70s thing where the only concessions were hot dogs or peanuts or watered down cokes or cheap domestic beers, and no walk up music, just some organ music here and there throughout the game? Do you think as a fan that would make a big difference? Do you think you'd still go to as many games as you did if that was what the ballpark experience was like?
Well, I did go to a lot of games when the ballpark experience was like that. One of the stories that I like to tell is that when I was 11 years old, my dad and I went to see the Mets play in Philly at the old vet. And almost as soon as the game was over, we almost made like an immediate decision to try to drive out to Three River Stadium, even though, Pittsburgh isn't exactly close to Philly, but I'd never been to Pittsburgh, and even as a child, I had wanted to visit all of the road stadiums. So that was always it wasn't really necessarily about the 360-degree experience that you see today. It was more just because, um, I wanted to visit these cities, I wanted to go to the stadiums, and I wanted to watch baseball. Like, that's my primary focus. But I realized, a lot of these types of like get off my lawn type of analysis that I'll hear about. They're selling sushi and goat cheese pizza at baseball games and whatnot. Um, I feel like nowadays you kind of have to focus on the fan experience because the games. I don't want to say the games on the diamond just aren't enough, but when you have guys like Juan Soto, and they're ginormous contracts, you're gonna have a lot of bitter people in the stands watching this guy, and he's, admittedly, he's been underperforming recently. And then that's all they've got. What's in it for me? What's in it for me as a fan, right? And then, well, the kids are gonna go to Kiddie Field out in, center field, the the concessions back there. There's going to be a Shake Shack. There's going to be a large TV. You're not going to miss a pitch of the game. Um, so you're getting kind of like the ballpark experience, but also it's more interactive for the fan. That's just how showbiz is these days. You've got, the digital media side of things. You've got the streaming side of things. Um, You've got, like, this whole, different experience, I think, than just and don't get me wrong, like, I really loved those days in the '80s, just, like, going to Old Shea Stadium and, um, I hated the vet for what it was worth. I thought it was crappy back then, but, it was, you went for the game and that was it. Now we're, like, just excited to, it's a social experience, it's a social event. I feel I visited, most of the current stadiums, and I haven't been to Sacramento, and I don't plan to as long as the Athletics are playing there. But it's, there's a different type of experience, and I think seeing what it's like in each city and each area. There's a unique little twist to each and every place that I visited that I've said, at the stadiums that get the little things right are the ones that are probably the best, as far as like experience, not just from watching the games, but just from the fan experience as well, Gotta get the fans engaged. And I know we talked about how you visited minor league park recently, and that was kind of like my inspiration is going to minor league parks and having more of those interactive types of moments with like the fans and the players and the accessibility in that respect. But you know what? I don't really fault anybody who wants, my dad recently had like a kind of like a get off my lawn type of response where he was waiting in line for like a popcorn and a water and they were all sold out, and he's like, I don't want any of that new crap. Like he was very much like, he would rather have like the hot dog vendor and like that type of experience where sometimes too much of a choice can't isn't necessarily the best thing, but, I think that there's like a happy medium in there somewhere as well.
Now, I want to make it clear that this is not directed at baseball. I think this goes on in any of the major sports. And the old saying is that if any league had to just depend on the diehards to survive, that none of them would. I mean, they have to do this type of outreach to be able to put 40,000 people in the stands, game after game after game. But I'm not sure if you remembered, but one time, a long time ago, the NFL did what they called the announcerless game. So for the people who were watching at home, all they heard were the ambient crowd noises. And, they had the graphics, second down and 8 or, whatever it was, but there was no announcers talking over. And I just thought that was an incredible experiment, something that, I wish they would do again.
Mm.
But I guess I just extrapolated that out to the ballpark experience. Would people watch another announcerless game? Would people watch a ball game where the only thing going on was the ball game? And it's just a theoretical discussion. I get it, but still, just as someone who sees as many games as you do, I was curious to see what your thoughts on the subject were.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that there's an announcerless game because I was like, I've heard that recently, but it was during a hockey game. Recently. I don't know if you're a hockey fan, but on some of the national broadcasts, you just get like the sounds of the crowd and the sounds of the boards and the players. And it's like, almost like being at a game without being at the game. And it was, it was kind of an interesting experience as well. But even in like, I don't know, I still kind of think like it's sort of trippy to like watch some of these games on like Apple TV or Roku where you've got like ads inside of ads and an ad in between like a pitching change when you can see the pitcher change. Like it's, media is just different now, and it's media entertainment and it's all about, the interaction with the fan experience and trying to try.
Now I know you're a hockey fan, and I don't really follow it anymore, but I used to. And there was one year where the Rangers went to the Stanley Cup final and they played the Canadians and they won game one and then got swept in the next four.
Mm.
And I can name you probably two-thirds of the players on that team, and I don't think I could name you one player who's on the current team. But Espo and Duguay and
Eh,
the Jam line, that's my era. All right, well, we talked about the hitters, so let's talk a little bit about the pitching. The starting pitchers have been, mostly very productive, but a lot of people are very, queasy, leery, whatever the word is, about the pitchers being able to continue to be productive moving forward. So I want to know: is there anyone in the group that you think is doing it with mirrors more so than actual stuff, and that you're afraid might turn into a pumpkin?
I mean, I think just by definition and his history, I would say maybe Clay Holmes. I don't know why I haven't really bought into what he's selling us right now. I probably should, but I guess it's just because I feel like, and I think that we probably discussed this in our chat and everything, is that he just has never really had the types of innings pitched history that he will, ultimately he probably will this year. But that said, like a lot of these starters have really overperformed. And we also have to remember, I hope things are better with him, but Sean Mania is going to return eventually. So, if somebody does sort of quote unquote revert back to a pumpkin, as you like to say, we do potentially have reinforcements coming in. So that should be, if it does get to that point, it might not. Clay Holmes might overperform and he might prove me wrong. And I hope he does. But there will be, I think a plan in play should that happen.
One of the things that could potentially happen would be moving a current starter to the bullpen once Manaya and the rest return. And one thing that I guess I've been thinking about lately is the lefty relievers. The Mets currently have two lefty relievers, but neither one of them are anyone that you would jump up and down and be all happy about if they came into the game. So do you think that the Mets are going to maybe move David Peterson into the bullpen, or do you think they'll trade for a lefty upgrade?
I could see a trade happening. I think, call me crazy, I think David Peterson has been way too valuable as a starter. He was slated for the bullpen, an extra arm in the playoffs. I remember that. But I don't see that happening. He has been incredibly strong, I felt. But that's, the beauty part about this team is that we know that they're not afraid to make moves and that they're not going to be like, oh, we're fine just the way we are. And hope is our plan. We know hope is never a plan with this team, and it shouldn't have been. So I think I would say on my list of concerns about the team, probably, the lefty relievers aren't high on that priority list. But I know that there has to be some reliable arms in the bullpen, but the bullpen has also been incredibly effective this year. So, there you go.
One of the things that we talk about a lot in the game chatters is the boogeyman, if you will, about 100 pitches and how managers and teams, and undoubtedly coming from the analytics group, are incredibly leery about letting their pitchers approach and especially exceed that number of 100 pitches. How much weight do you think Carlos Mendoza should put on that 100 pitch boogeyman?
Well, ironically, I think he almost panics before they get to 100 pitches. I believe last night he took Tyler McGill out at like 85 pitches. Or was that last night? I'm sorry, I'm losing track of days. But it was. And he was very, very effective. It was before it was like 4 and 2/3, and he couldn't, potentially qualify for a win or whatever if he had taken him out. But I think he might panic and lean on the bullpen a little too much for my liking. But it's also very early in the season. We have to remember that we haven't even hit June. And like I said, the bullpen has been very effective, but there's going to be a time when there might not be as effective. And our starters obviously are gonna have to start going longer into games. The 100 pitch thing has been an issue for however many years. It's not going away. Um, he I think but, then we had Kodai Senga the other night, like, basically, I think what was he at? You might remember the exact pitch count. It was like he might have been at, like, 92 or 93 pitches, and he was like, "No, I'm going back out there." He wanted to finish what he started, and he did. I mean, he didn't pitch a complete game, obviously, but he wanted to, that was really what I felt like I'm in the best position to help this team win. They didn't win, but whatever. It's one of those things where I think like he also has to go on. I talk about going on vibes sometimes. And if you think that your young arm is tapped out at 85 or 86 pitches, then okay, I'm gonna have to trust him. But I have learned to really trust Carlos Mendoza and um his vibes, as I like to say, because he's been very cool, calm, and collected in moments that I know previous managers would have 100% panicked at. And he's been, very much like, we got this. Even when we don't got it, we'll have it eventually.
We all want to do things to keep pitchers, especially starting pitchers, healthy. And my opinion is that we've gone overboard with this slavish devotion to pitch counts. It reminds me of a scene from the old TV show MASH, and Hawkeye lost a patient, and Henry Blake is trying to console him, and he says, all I know is what they told me in command school, and there's two rules at play in a war, and rule one is young people die, and rule two is doctors can't change rule one.
Mm,
And I think about that in terms of pitch counts a lot. We want to keep them safe, but there's absolutely no proof that throwing 99 pitches equals safe and 105 pitches equals danger.
mm,
I think we're just, we have that round number, and we put a lot of weight on it. And I think that smart teams at some point are gonna realize that it doesn't need to be that way. And to me, it's more important how the pitcher is doing. And in the Senga game that you just referenced, he really struggled the first 3 innings in that game. I was having trouble throwing strikes, but then he found it. And his best inning was the fifth inning, and then he walked off the mound after that fifth inning, and he was pointing with his index finger, essentially telling Mendoza, one more inning. I've got one more inning. Let me pitch
right.
one more inning. And Mendoza did. I think he ended up with exactly 100 pitches. Maybe it was 102, but, I think ordinarily Mendoza would have pulled him.
Hmm.
But because Senga was so adamant about, yeah, I've got this, like you were saying, I've got this, that the manager listened, and that was good. And I think that more of that needs to happen.
Right. No, I agree with that. And like I said, I'm even as much as I will look at analytics to kind of prove a point, I also go on vibes. And I think that that was a good example of Mendoza and even Senga going on vibes.
Well, speaking of vibes, it is crazy prediction time. I'm going to give you a crazy prediction, okay? And I'm going to ask you to comment on it. And then you'll give me a crazy prediction, and I'll comment on yours, okay?
All right.
All right, so my crazy prediction is that Ronny Mauricio joins the team next month and puts up an OPS plus 100 points higher than our boy Acuna, who currently sits with a 642 OPS. So I want to know from you, how crazy is that?
I don't think that's crazy at all. I could absolutely see Mauricio coming to the major league team and just absolutely raking. I could see that happening for sure.
All right, so I failed in my attempt for a crazy prediction. So show me how it's done. What's your crazy prediction?
I'm not really sure how bold it is, but I used to call this on Twitter slash X the bold coup prediction. And my bold coup prediction is that Luis Torrens, I think, is going to outperform Francisco Alvarez this year. As much as I'm an Alvarez fan, I really liked what I've seen with Torrens.
All right. So before I weigh in on whether I think that's crazy or not, do you think it's going to be in, more or less the current breakdown that they have where Alvarez, will play in 4 games and Torrens will play two? Do you think that production will switch that where they're at least 50-50 or even more for Torrens than Alvarez?
So I think we might expect. I mean, what I'm sort of seeing is I think Alvarez might still be recovering from his injury. And although I do think he's got higher upside, I mean, there's a reason why the starters, even guys like Max Scherzer, really love pitching to him, is that he calls a good game. But I'm just saying for this season, officially, I could see Torrens maybe stepping up a little bit more because I don't know, I guess I don't know. I sometimes gravitate toward, like I said, I love catchers. I sometimes gravitate towards them, and I really liked what I've seen from Luis Torrens when he has played.
Now, if you said that Torrens was going to play at least as much, if not more than Alvarez, I would have said you're crazy. But I can't give you the crazy prediction without that. So
Okay.
it seems like we both swung and missed on the
Uh,
crazy prediction. All right, well let's talk about the team. We're near the end of May, and as I'm sure everyone remembers, last year the Mets were 9-19 in the month of May. It was brutal. This year it feels like they're doing really bad in May, and they're 9-10. So they're essentially playing 500 ball in May. So how do you feel about the team right now?
I mean, I mentioned earlier in this session, and I'll say it again, is that our hot bats went cold at probably the worst time. And what I mean is, like, yeah, it's May. I think it would suck more if it happened in September, let's be fair. And we have seen that. We've seen that
22.
way too many times. And I would almost rather it happen now because we saw it happen last year as well. And we saw how well the team did at the end of the season. So honestly, I would rather see this May slump than the prototypical June swoon, which I really think last year was probably the first year in several that the Mets actually did not just well, they did incredibly well in June. I'm used to them having that downturn then, but I do see it just more as indicative of the bats not showing up when we needed them to, especially on, you know, I normally would not care less about an interleague game where the Mets lost 2 out of 3. But it was to the Yankees. We always wanna beat the Yankees,
Yes,
right?
yes, we do.
Uh, and the Red Sox series was frustrating as well because I knew that, the team was in a position to beat the Red Sox, and they didn't. So,
So you referenced the recent June swoons, and I'll also include last year's May malaise. I think those have lined up with when the Mets had a West Coast trip, and this recent play here in May. Yeah, they've played some good teams, but we haven't seen the West Coast trip yet. I mean, yeah, they went out to Arizona and Sacramento, but we haven't played LA, we haven't played San Diego, they haven't played the Giants, three really good teams on the road. So I guess I'm kind of holding my breath until we start making those West Coast trips to really, I guess, cement how I feel about this year's Mets. Cautiously optimistic, but still concerned about those West Coast trips.
yeah, I remember in 2023, you remember that the Mets had a very early West Coast trip where they trying to remember I think it was Oakland, LA, then San Francisco. And if I gosh, what was it? I used to be able to rattle this statistic off, but I think do you remember that, Ed? They lost like
I
3
do.
games.
They got off to a
Yeah.
really good start. They
Yeah.
were 9 or 10 games above 500,
Yeah.
and then that trip happened and everything fell to pieces.
Yeah, but the funny thing was that road trip, they were actually very successful. I even said in the past, that was the type of road trip we would have made excuses for. Well, it's early in the season. It was the West Coast. It was the Dodgers. It was the blah, blah, blah. It was the jet lag. It was the whatever. They actually did. I believe they swept Oakland, maybe took 2 out of 3, and maybe they were 1 and 2 against the Giants. I think they were 2 and 1 against the Dodgers and then 1 and 2 against the Giants, but we were, like, willing to take it because it was like, "Dude, like, that never happens." But then they came back home and it was just a disaster. That was like I said, that was when they, kinda decided to go long on futures and, they shorted the blue chips like Justin Verlander and Max Scherzer, and then, they held on to their long-term investments like Alonso and McNeil and Lindor. But I remember that road trip being so early in the season. I thought, "We got this," especially after how 2022 ended. And then, so this year it will be, I guess I kinda look at those road trips, maybe maybe a little bit differently. I often am like, if they can be, if it's like 13 games, I don't know how many they're going to play off the top of my head, but if they go 7-6, I'll be happy. It's, you know, it's one of those things, I guess.
Your memory is very good. I just looked it up. So this is 2023, and they did a West Coast trip with the A's, the Dodgers, and the Giants, and they started out 7-1 in that stretch. They swept Oakland, won 2 of 3 from the Dodgers, and then they won the first 2 games in San Francisco. But then they lost the next 2 games, and
Okay, that's right.
that was. But you were right. They did very well on that West Coast trip until the very end, and then the losing seemingly never stopped after that point. So
Uh-huh.
pat yourself on your back for your memory. All right. Well, we've got time for one more question, and we've talked a lot about the Mets offense kind of scuffling here recently for whatever reasons. So, we try to be optimistic. So I want you to tell me something to make me feel good about the Mets offense.
Oh, I think absolutely it was the back of the Packers. The bottom of the order overperformed. If it wasn't for the top bats underperforming or just not performing at all, we would have won some games, but it was guys like Taylor, it was guys like Beatty, they were the ones who were really showing up, and I think that's what's gonna help you win games. You can't just have your top performers hitting every time you think they're gonna get a hit. You need everyone to contribute, and I think that's kinda telling for where the team is gonna go when they just start clicking on all cylinders. As they like to say, "Don't let the Mets get hot," and, that's gonna be bad for the rest of the the re
I'm a Vikings fan, and I thought you said Packers, and I was
I'm
like, "Wait, wait,
sorry.
wait, wait. This is supposed to make me feel good. It's not gonna make me feel good if you talk about the Packers." But, yes.
When I said Packers, I was actually like, "Oh, wow, I'm not talking about football," but yeah.
But you're absolutely right. The bottom 3, 4 hitters, especially here recently, have been performing very well. Last night, I believe it was, Acuna and Beatty with 2 hits. Tyrone Taylor might have had 2 hits in that span too. So when those guys, the guys who aren't necessarily the headliners, the guys making close to minimum wage, when they're hitting, I mean, it's potentially a deep lineup. Now we just need to get Soto to swing the bat and Alonso to make contact, and everything will be great.
Yeah, that's it.
That's all.
We've solved all the Mets problems.
Well, Taryn, thanks so much for stopping by. I really enjoyed our chat, and then hopefully we can get off to a good start against the Dodgers. You going to any of those games?
I'm actually not. I'm going to sit out the Dodger series. It's a very busy weekend for my, line of work, unfortunately, but I will be going to Monday's game. So, I'm disappointed because I love Freddie Freeman, so I'm not gonna be able to see him this season, but who knows if he's, gonna be play if we're gonna be facing the Dodgers in the postseason, maybe I'll see him then.
There you go. Well, hopefully you'll be able to join us in the chatter.
Yeah.
Again, thank you for dropping by. And I also want to thank our listeners for hanging in with us throughout this chat. And then hopefully we'll have another one again here soon. Good night, everyone.